The sky above Harvest Prime split open like a wound. Governor Elias Zhao was sitting in his office, reading a report about grain shipments, when the first kinetic rod hit the capital city. The building shook so hard that the windows cracked in every direction. He fell out of his chair and crawled to the window, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. A column of fire was rising from the city center, so tall it seemed to touch the clouds. Then another one hit, and another. Harvest Prime was humanity's largest farming colony. 60 million people lived there, spread across green valleys and golden plains. It was a peaceful place, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night. Now it was burning. The attack came from the Drajin Dominion, a species of tall, reptilian creatures who had built their empire by taking what they wanted from weaker races. They had watched humanity for decades. They had studied the colony positions, the patrol routes, and the fleet numbers. And they had decided that humans were soft, easy prey, a mid-tier species with a small military and no real taste for war. High Warlord Talverath commanded the assault from his flagship, the Dominion's Fang, in high orbit above Harvest Prime. He was cold and patient, the way a predator is patient before it strikes. He had ordered simultaneous attacks on 4 human colonies: Harvest Prime, Ashfall, New Lisbon, Korat Station. 4 strikes at once, fast and brutal, designed to break humanity's spirit before they could even react. On Ashfall, a dusty mining colony on the edge of human space, a young combat engineer named Kale Morrow heard the explosions before he saw them. He was underground, checking support beams in a mine shaft, when the ground shook and dust rained from the ceiling. He ran to the surface and saw Drazian dropships falling from the sky like metal seeds, landing in the fields outside the colony settlement. Kale did not freeze. He did not run. He grabbed his radio and called every miner, every engineer, every person who could hold a tool or carry a charge. Within an hour, he had organized 300 civilians into something that looked nothing like an army, but fought like one. The Drazian ground forces walked into the settlement expecting terrified civilians on their knees. That was what always happened. Every species they had conquered before had surrendered quickly once the bombardment began. Instead, they walked into a kill zone, mining charges buried in the road, industrial lasers rewired into weapons, excavation drones reprogrammed to ram into landing craft. A woman who had been a schoolteacher 2 hours ago fired a bolt gun from a rooftop and took down a Drajin officer before anyone could stop her. Kale moved through the chaos like a ghost, setting traps, redirecting teams, plugging gaps in their defense. He was not a soldier. None of them were. But something old and deep had woken up inside every single person on that colony, something that said very clearly, "This is our home, and you will bleed for every step you take into it." Back on Harvest Prime, Governor Zhao managed to get the underground bunker systems open. The colony had been built with emergency shelters beneath every major city, a standard feature of all human settlements. Most people thought they would never be used. Now millions of people poured into them, while fire rained from above. Zhao stood at the entrance of the main shelter, guiding people in, refusing to go below until the last person was safe. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. He found a working communications array in the shelter and sent a distress signal to Earth. It was short and desperate. 4 colonies under attack, massive casualties, requesting immediate assistance. He sent it, and then sat down on the cold metal floor and waited, because there was nothing else he could do. At the Galactic Concord, the great alliance of over 200 spacefaring species, the news of the attack arrived within hours. Ambassadors from dozens of worlds watched the reports with mild interest. This sort of thing happened from time to time. A strong species would attack a weaker one, take some territory, and the weaker species would accept new terms. It was the way of things. Ambassador Fesic, a tall insectoid diplomat from the Karathi species, reviewed the situation and prepared a mediation offer. He had done this many times before. The Drajin would demand territory and resources. Humanity would resist at first, then accept. Fesic would help negotiate terms that were not too humiliating. Everyone would move on. He was already drafting the proposal when one of his aides showed him something strange in the sensor data. Human communication channels, which were normally quiet and routine, had suddenly exploded with activity. Military frequencies that had been silent for a century were lighting up across the entire Sol system. Fesic paused. He looked at the data again. Then he set his proposal aside and decided to wait. 600 light-years away, at Arcturus Hub, Admiral Lyra Okonkwo received the distress calls from all 4 colonies at almost the same time. She stood in the command center of the station, surrounded by officers who were looking at her with wide eyes, waiting for orders. Okonkwo was a tall woman with gray hair and scars on her hands from a border skirmish 15 years ago. She had spent her career commanding a defense fleet that most people considered unnecessary. Humanity was at peace, had been for generations. The colonial defense fleet was small, underfunded, and mostly used for anti-piracy patrols. She read each distress signal carefully. She looked at the tactical display showing Drajin fleet positions around the 4 colonies. She said nothing for 90 seconds. The room was so quiet that people could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. Then she opened a channel to Earth High Command and spoke 6 words that would change the history of the galaxy. Wake them up. All of them. On Earth, those words triggered a cascade of events that had been planned for over a century, but never activated. Emergency wartime protocols, buried deep in the government's most classified systems, began to unlock one after another, like doors opening in a long, dark hallway. Deep beneath the surface of the moon, in a facility that no alien species had ever seen or even suspected existed, lights flickered on for the first time in 112 years. Machines that had been sleeping in the cold and the dark began to warm up. Screens glowed. Systems checked themselves and reported ready. The facility was called the Lunar Vault, and it contained everything that humanity had built during its long and bloody history of war. Everything that they had looked at, been horrified by, and locked away, promising themselves they would never use it unless there was no other choice. Now, there was no other choice. Across the Sol system, shipyards hidden inside asteroids received activation codes. Factories on Mars and Europa began switching from civilian production to military output. And on Earth itself, something happened that the galaxy would have found impossible to believe. There was no panic. There was no chaos. There were no riots or protests or demands for negotiation. Instead, there were volunteers, millions of them, then hundreds of millions. Ordinary people walking into recruitment centers, lining up outside factories, offering their ships, their skills, their time, and their lives. Not because they were forced, not because they were afraid, because someone had hurt their people. And every human being alive understood in their bones what that meant and what had to happen next. The galaxy had made a mistake. It had looked at humanity's small fleet and quiet colonies and peaceful trade routes and concluded that humans were harmless. They were about to learn the difference between peaceful and harmless. 72 hours after the first bombs fell on Harvest Prime, Ambassador Fesic arrived on Earth to deliver the Drajin Dominion's terms of surrender. He came aboard a Concord diplomatic shuttle, polished white and marked with the symbols of galactic neutrality. He had done this many times before for other species. The process was always the same. The conquered species would be angry at first, then afraid, then practical. They would accept the terms because the alternative was worse. Thesic believed he was doing a kind thing by helping humanity accept the inevitable. Secretary General Adeze Nwosu met him in a conference room overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. She was a small woman with dark skin and calm eyes, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the room had gotten quieter. She wore a simple gray suit. She offered Thesic water. She smiled. Thesic laid out the terms. Humanity would surrender its 4 attacked colonies permanently. It would pay reparations in raw materials, enough to fill 100 cargo ships. It would accept Drazine military observers on all remaining human worlds. And it would publicly acknowledge the Drazine Dominion's superiority. He explained that these terms were, by galactic standards, generous. Most conquered species lost much more. The Drazine were being reasonable. The Concord supported mediation. If humanity accepted, the killing would stop. Nwosu listened to every word without interrupting. When Thesic finished, she thanked him for making the journey. Then she leaned forward slightly and asked him one question. In your records, Ambassador, has any species ever explained to the Concord what total war means? Thesic tilted his head. He did not understand the question. He explained that all civilized species practiced limited warfare. Controlled conflicts over territory, border adjustments, measured responses, that was how it had always worked. Nwosu nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. She told Thesic that humanity had learned something a long time ago, back when they were still fighting each other on a single planet. They had learned that limited wars dragged on, that measured responses invited escalation, that holding back cost more lives in the end than finishing things decisively. So, humanity had developed a different philosophy. When they went to war, they did not escalate step by step. They did not match force with equal force. They arrived at maximum. They brought everything they had, all at once, and they ended it. We do not do proportional responses, Nwosu said. We tried that. It didn't work. Too many people died while we were being measured. She told Thesic to take the Drazine's terms back and inform them that humanity would be delivering its own terms shortly. In person. Thesic left Earth, confused and uneasy. Something in the woman's eyes had disturbed him, though he could not say exactly what. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something much worse. It was certainty. While Nwosu was having that conversation, General Marcus Draven was already 3 days into the largest military mobilization in human history. Draven was the head of Solcom, Solar Command, the defense force responsible for protecting Earth and the Sol system. He was a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a voice like gravel rolling downhill. He had spent 30 years building, planning, and preparing for a war that everyone told him would never happen. Every budget meeting, every political debate, every time someone called military spending a waste, Draven had sat quietly and kept building. Now he activated Doctrine Omega. Across the Sol system, things began to move. In the asteroid belt, enormous doors opened in the sides of rocks that everyone thought were just rocks. Inside were shipyards, dark and cold for decades, now flooding with light and heat and workers. These yards had been built in secret during humanity's early colonial period, when the government decided that having a visible military would make them a target, but having no military at all would make them a victim. So they built both. A small, visible fleet for patrols and diplomacy, and a hidden fleet for the day everything went wrong. The hidden fleet was enormous. Ships began rolling off assembly lines that had been designed for exactly this kind of emergency production. They were not elegant. They were not pretty. They were brutal, efficient killing machines, built by a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare, and then spent a few centuries pretending it had forgotten how. On Mars, Factories that made farming equipment yesterday were making weapons today. On Europa, research stations switched from studying ice formations to producing advanced missile guidance systems. On Earth, civilian shipyards began armoring freighters and cargo haulers, turning them into troop transports and fire support platforms. And the people came. They came by the millions. Engineers, pilots, doctors, teachers, miners, cooks. People who had never held a weapon in their lives walked into training centers and said, "Show me what to do." There was no draft. There was no conscription law. Nobody forced anyone. They came because their colonies had been burned and their people had been killed, and that was enough. The lunar vault was the last thing to open. Deep beneath the surface of the moon, behind doors made of a metal alloy that could survive a direct nuclear strike, was humanity's darkest library. Every weapon too terrible for peacetime use was stored there. Designs for bombs that could crack a planet's crust. Biological agents that could target specific species. Electronic warfare systems that could shut down an entire fleet's computers in seconds. Weapons that humanity's own scientists had built, tested, looked at with horror, and then locked away, with the agreement that they would only be opened if the survival of the species was at stake. General Draven opened the vault personally. He walked through the corridors, reading labels, making selections. He did not take everything. Humanity was not trying to commit genocide, but he took enough. Meanwhile, on the 4 occupied colonies, the Drajin were learning something that no intelligence report had prepared them for. Human beings did not stop fighting when they lost. They fought harder. On Ashfall, Kale Morrow had turned the mining colony into a fortress. Every tunnel was a trap. Every abandoned building was an ambush point. The Drajin sent soldiers into the mines, and the soldiers did not come back. They sent armored vehicles down the main road, and the road exploded beneath them. They set up a command post in the town square and woke up the next morning to find that someone had painted a message on the wall in the night, right next to the sleeping guards. "We are still here." The Drajin had conquered 11 species before humanity. None of them had resisted like this. None of them had kept fighting after the bombardment. None of them had looked at an occupying army and decided with cold and furious determination to make every single day a nightmare for the invaders. Kale lost people every day. Friends, neighbors, a woman named Sophia, who used to run the colony's bakery and now ran a sniper team from the rooftops. Every loss hurt, but they did not stop. They could not stop. Something inside them simply would not allow it. High Warlord Talvareth received weekly reports from the occupied colonies. The casualty numbers were irritating, but not alarming. He was more focused on the diplomatic situation. He expected humanity to negotiate. When his intelligence officers showed him data about unusual activity in the Sol system, he reviewed it and dismissed it. Humanity's registered fleet was small. Their technology was average. Whatever they were building, it could not possibly change the balance of power. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, historically wrong. 3 weeks after the attack, Admiral Lyra Okonkwo's fleet exited slipspace in the Harvest Prime system. The Drajin sensors detected 300 warships at first. Then the number climbed. 500, 1,000, 2,000. The sensor operators called their commanders. The commanders called the flagship. The flagship called Talvareth. 4,200 vessels hung in the darkness of space around Harvest Prime. Warships, carriers, destroyers, and behind them, thousands more. Converted freighters with guns welded to their hulls. Mining barges carrying missile launchers. Civilian transports packed with soldiers who had been farmers and teachers and shopkeepers a month ago. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship, the TNS Resolve, and looked at the tactical display showing the Drajin fleet. 800 ships, a powerful force. By galactic standards, overwhelming. She opened a broadcast on every frequency. Her voice was calm and steady, and carried the weight of a species that had finally stopped pretending to be something it was not. This is Admiral Lyra Okonkwo of the United Terran Navy. You have attacked our people. You have burned our homes. We are here to discuss your terms of surrender. You have 1 hour. She closed the channel. Then she sat down in her command chair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The hour passed in silence. Admiral Okonkwo sat in her command chair aboard the TNS Resolve and watched the clock count down to 0. Around her, 4,000 human vessels drifted in the black emptiness of space, their engines humming, their weapons hot, their crews waiting. On the other side of the system, 800 Drajine warships held formation around Harvest Prime, their commanders staring at sensor screens that showed numbers they could not believe. The Drajine did not respond to the surrender demand. High Warlord Talverath, watching from the bridge of the Dominion's Fang, had considered it for exactly 12 seconds before deciding it was a bluff. No mid-tier species could produce this many ships in 3 weeks. The sensor data had to be wrong. Electronic tricks, decoys, ghost signals. Humanity was trying to scare him into retreat. The hour ended. Okonkwo did not send a second message. She simply looked at her tactical officer and nodded once. The Battle of Harvest Prime began. The first thing the Drajine noticed was that the human fleet did not move the way fleets were supposed to move. Every species in the galaxy fought in formation. Neat lines, organized ranks, command ships in the center, escorts on the flanks. It was the standard approach to space combat, tested and proven over thousands of years of galactic warfare. The humans came at them like a swarm of angry insects. Ships broke into small packs of 5 or 6, moving independently, weaving and circling and attacking from every direction at once. There was no center to the formation, because there was no formation. Every ship was connected to every other ship through a shared tactical network, an artificial intelligence system that processed battlefield data in real time and fed targeting solutions to every vessel simultaneously. Each pack made its own decisions, adapted to its own situation, and coordinated with the packs around it without waiting for orders from above. The Drajine command structure was built on hierarchy. Orders came from the top and flowed down. When Talverath gave a command, it passed through 4 levels of officers before reaching the ships that would carry it out. This system worked well against enemies who fought in formation, because formations were predictable. You could see what they were doing and respond in time. You could not see what the humans were doing. By the time a Drajine commander identified a threat and sent orders to counter it, the threat had already moved, split into 3 groups, and attacked from a different angle. Then the weapons came out. The galaxy knew about human railguns. Small, simple devices that used magnetic fields to accelerate metal slugs. Every species had something similar. Nothing special. The kinetic lances that hit the Drajine fleet were not small, and they were not simple. They were railgun projectiles the size of ground vehicles, accelerated to 12% of the speed of light. They crossed the distance between the fleets in seconds. They did not explode on impact. They did not need to. At that speed, a solid piece of metal carries more energy than a nuclear bomb. The first lance hit a Drajine heavy cruiser in the center of its hull and punched clean through it, entering from the front and exiting from the back, leaving a hole wide enough to fly a shuttle through. 6 more cruisers died the same way in the first 2 minutes. Talverath screamed orders to spread the formation, to put distance between ships so the lances could not hit multiple targets. His captains obeyed, but spreading out only made them more vulnerable to the next weapon humanity revealed. Cascade missiles. They looked like ordinary warheads on approach, and the Drajine point defense guns shot down most of them. But the ones that got through did not simply explode. They detonated in a chain reaction that spread outward in a sphere of energy. and any ship caught in that sphere had its shields overloaded and its hull torn apart. The missiles were designed to punish tight formations, but they were just as deadly against scattered ships because they did not need a direct hit. They just needed to be close. And then came the ghost ships, unmanned carriers, each one loaded with 1,000 microfighters no bigger than a person. The carriers launched their swarms at close range, and suddenly the space around the Dragine fleet was filled with tiny, fast, impossible-to-track drones that swarmed over capital ships like metal wasps. They jammed sensors. They overloaded point defense systems by presenting thousands of targets at once. And while the Dragine guns were busy trying to swat drones, the manned human ships moved in for killing shots. The Dragine fleet began to break apart. Not in an organized retreat, in panic. Talvareth stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display turn red, one ship after another disappearing or going dark. He had fought 17 battles in his career and never lost. He had conquered 3 species and broken their militaries in weeks. He was the greatest military commander the Dragine Dominion had produced in 2 centuries. He had no idea what to do. The humans were not just beating his fleet, they were taking it apart with the calm efficiency of a mechanic disassembling a machine. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary destruction. Every attack had a purpose, every maneuver created an advantage. It was not warfare as the galaxy understood it. It was something older and more refined, a craft perfected over thousands of years by a species that had spent most of its history fighting itself. Below, on the surface of Harvest Prime, the ground war turned at the same moment. Governor Zhao had been coordinating with the resistance from the underground shelters for 3 weeks. When the Dragine fleet in orbit began to burn, he gave the signal. Across the planet, in every occupied city, human insurgents attacked at once. Power stations were sabotaged. Communication towers were brought down. Supply depots were raided or destroyed. Kale Morrow had been smuggled from Ashfall to Harvest Prime aboard a blockade runner, a fast civilian ship that slipped through the chaos of the orbital battle. He landed in the ruins of the capital with a team of 30 volunteers and one objective: destroy the planetary shield generator that was protecting the Dragine ground headquarters from orbital strikes. The generator was in a bunker, surrounded by 300 Dragine soldiers. Kale had 30 people, some mining explosives, and a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and he was not entirely sure which. They went through the sewer system. Kale had memorized the Colonies' infrastructure maps years ago, back when his job was maintaining the water treatment plants. He led his team through 2 kilometers of dark, flooded tunnels, placed charges on the bunker's foundation supports, and detonated them from 300 meters away. The bunker collapsed. The shield generator went dark, and 15 seconds later, the first wave of Terran Marines dropped from orbit directly onto the Dragine command center in armored drop pods that hit the ground like thunder. The ground battle lasted 4 hours. The orbital battle lasted 11. By the end, over 600 Dragine ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 200 were scattered and running. Talvarath escaped aboard the Dominion's Fang, which had taken so much damage that half its decks were open to space. He sat in a sealed compartment on the only functioning deck and stared at nothing for a very long time. At the Galactic Concord, Ambassador Thesic watched the battle data arrive in real time. He played the sensor recordings. He looked at the casualty figures. He played them again. Then a third time. A colleague from the Vareshi delegation walked over and asked if he was all right. Thesic was standing very still, his insectoid eyes fixed on the screen. "They were not even trying before," Thesic said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "All this time, all these years we watched them and studied them and classified them. They were not even trying." The colleague did not understand. Thesic turned to him and said it more clearly. "We put them in Tier 4. We said they were mid-level, average military, limited fleet, No threat to established powers. He pointed at the screen, where the wreckage of the Drajin fleet was still spreading across the Harvest Prime system in a cloud of metal and fire. They built that fleet in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, from nothing. What do you think they could build in a year? The colleague did not answer. He did not need to. Admiral Okonkwo received confirmation that all 4 human colonies had been liberated. Secondary fleets had struck New Lisbon, Ashfall, and Korat Station simultaneously. Every Drajin soldier in human space was dead, captured, or in full retreat. Her aide approached her chair and asked whether they should begin fortifying the border against a counterattack. Okonkwo looked at the star map. She looked at the cluster of stars that marked Drajin territory. Dozens of systems, billions of soldiers, a military empire 3,000 years old. She shook her head slowly. "We are not defending anymore," she said. For the first time in 3,000 years, an enemy fleet entered Drajin space. Expeditionary Force Prometheus, as it was now officially named, moves through the first Drajin border system without resistance. The border stations had been abandoned. The patrol ships had been pulled back. The Drajin were regrouping, pulling their forces toward the core of their empire, and the outer systems had been left empty and silent. Admiral Okonkwo split her fleet into 3 groups. One pushed along the northern corridor toward the Drajin military shipyards. One moved through the southern systems toward their weapons research stations. And the third, the main force under Okonkwo herself, drove straight toward the heart of the Dominion, toward Draja Prime. Ambassador Fesick was aboard Okonkwo's flagship. The Galactic Concord had asked to send an observer, and Okonkwo had agreed, partly because she wanted the galaxy to see exactly what was about to happen, and partly because she wanted them to see how it happened. Fesick expected to see what every conquering fleet in galactic history had done: burning cities, enslaved populations, occupied worlds stripped of resources. That was how empires expanded. That was what the Drajin themselves had done to 11 species before humanity. What he saw instead confused him deeply. The human fleet entered each system, identified every military target, and destroyed it with precise, overwhelming force. Shipyards were reduced to debris. Weapons platforms were blown apart. Military bases were hit from orbit with surgical strikes that left craters where the bases had been, and left everything around them untouched. And then the fleet moved on. They did not land troops to occupy the planets. They did not demand tribute from the civilian populations. They did not even disable civilian infrastructure. Power grids kept running. Water systems kept flowing. Hospitals kept operating. Fesick went to Okonkwo and asked her why. She looked at him with an expression that was tired and hard and sad all at once. "We are not here to conquer anyone, Ambassador. We are here to make sure they can never do this again." He asked what the difference was. She told him to keep watching. On the ground, Sub-Commander Rin Vasari was leading the marine operations on the Drajin worlds that required direct assault. Some military installations were underground or shielded in ways that orbital strikes could not reach. For those, Vasari's Marines went in on foot. Vasari was 34 years old and had been a Marine for 12 of those years. She was short and muscular, with black hair cut close to her skull and eyes that missed nothing. She was very good at her job, which was breaking down doors and clearing rooms and taking ground from people who did not want to give it up. She was also, despite everything she had seen and done, deeply committed to one principle that she enforced with iron discipline among her troops: no civilian casualties. Zero. None. Her Marines carried 2 types of ammunition: lethal rounds for enemy soldiers, non-lethal suppression charges for everyone else. Every Marine had medical supplies for treating wounded, including wounded Drajin. Every squad had a translator programmed with basic Drajine language, so they could tell civilians to stay down and stay safe. The Drajine did not understand this at all. On a world called Threk Voss, Viserys Marines stormed a military command bunker buried beneath a civilian city. They fought through 2 levels of Drajine soldiers, lost 3 of their own, and took the bunker in 40 minutes. In the lowest level, they found a group of Drajine officers and about 200 civilian workers who maintained the facility's systems. The civilians were terrified. They pressed themselves against the walls and waited to die. That was what happened when your world was conquered. Everyone knew that. Viserys walked through the group, her weapon lowered, and spoke to them through the translator. She told them the fighting was over. She told them they were not prisoners. She told them to go home to their families. The civilians did not move. They did not believe her. So Viserys sat down on the floor, took off her helmet, and waited. After about 20 minutes, a young Drajine female, barely grown, asked her through the translator why the humans were not killing them. Viserys looked at her and said, "Because you did not attack our colonies. Your military did. Your government did. We do not punish people for the crimes of their leaders." The young Drajine stared at her for a long time. Then she walked out of the bunker. One by one, the others followed. A captured Drajine officer, a veteran who had fought in 3 of the Dominion's previous conquests, was treated by a human field medic, who bandaged his wounds and gave him painkillers. The officer lay on a stretcher and looked up at the medic with an expression of total confusion. "Why?" he asked. The medic shrugged. "Because you are hurt, and I am a doctor. That is the whole reason." Word spread through the Drajine civilian population faster than the human fleet moved. The invaders were destroying the military, but leaving everyone else alone. They were treating prisoners with care. They were not stealing, not burning, not enslaving. The Drajine people did not know what to do with this information. It did not fit into any category they had for how wars worked. Some called it a trick. Some called it weakness. But as the weeks went on, more and more of them simply called it strange, and they stopped running when the human ships appeared in their skies. High Warlord Talvarath had no time to think about mercy. He was fighting for the survival of his species, or so he believed. He rallied the full might of the Drajine Dominion at Draza Prime. 3,000 warships, the largest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon they had left was gathered to defend the homeworld. Talvarath stood on the bridge of a new flagship, the Dominion's Wrath, and looked at his fleet with fierce pride. This was the strength of a 3,000-year empire. They would break against this wall, like water against stone. Then General Marcus Draven arrived with the Sol fleet. The Sol fleet was Earth's last line of defense, the force that existed to protect the home system if everything else failed. It had never left the solar system. It had never been seen by any alien species. It was the most classified military asset humanity possessed. It was also, ship for ship, the most advanced and powerful fleet in the known galaxy. The Sol fleet's ships were bigger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything in the expeditionary force. They were built with technology from the Lunar Vault, weapons and systems that had never been used in combat, because they had never needed to be. Stealth destroyers that could fire from invisibility. Electronic warfare platforms that could scramble an entire fleet's communications with a single pulse. Carrier ships loaded with next-generation drone swarms that made the ones used at Harvest Prime look like toys. The Drajine sensors counted the combined human fleet, 7,000 ships. Talvarath stared at the number, and for the first time in his life, felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. The Battle of Draza Prime lasted 6 hours. It should have been the greatest battle in Drajine history. It was, but not in the way they had hoped. The human electronic warfare ships struck first, sending out a wave of interference that blinded every Dragine sensor in the system. For 90 seconds, the entire Dragine fleet was deaf and blind. In those 90 seconds, stealth destroyers decloaked and fired precision strikes at every Dragine command ship, crippling their communications and cutting the chain of command to pieces. When the sensors came back online, the Dragine fleet was in chaos. Ships that had lost contact with their commanders did not know what to do. Some fought, some tried to retreat, some simply drifted, their crews frozen by the loss of orders from above. The drone swarms came next, millions of tiny machines pouring through the gaps in the Dragine formation. And then the main fleet hit them from 3 sides at once, and it was over. Tal Varath fought to the end. Whatever else could be said about him, he was not a coward. He commanded his ship personally when his officers were dead, firing weapons with his own hands, roaring defiance at the human fleet closing in around him. His ship was hit 17 times. When it finally lost power and drifted dead in space, Tal Varath was still standing on his bridge, bleeding from wounds on his face and chest, refusing to fall. The Sari's Marines boarded the Dominion's Wrath and took him alive. He was treated by a medic, given food and water, and placed in a clean holding cell. He sat on the floor of that cell and tried to understand what had happened to his empire. Ambassador Thesic wrote his report to the Galactic Concord that night. He had spent weeks watching humanity fight, and he had finally found the words for what he had seen. He created a new classification category. He called it Apex Dormant Predator, which he defined as a species that had deliberately suppressed its own combat capability to coexist peacefully with other species, but retained the full ability to reactivate that capability at will. He recommended that humanity be immediately reclassified from Tier 4 to Tier 1. His report ended with a single recommendation, written in capital letters, so that no Concord diplomat could possibly miss it. Do not provoke. Secretary General Nwosu traveled to Draja Prime to begin peace negotiations. She arrived aboard a diplomatic vessel, unarmed, with a small staff of translators and legal advisors. She was prepared to end the war the same way humanity had fought it, with precision, with purpose, and without cruelty. But as her ship entered the Draja system, she received an encrypted message from Concord Intelligence. She read it alone in her cabin, and her calm expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into place. 14 other species in the galaxy had begun secretly mobilizing their fleets. Not to attack the Dragine, not to help the Dragine. They were mobilizing because of humanity. They had watched a species they considered harmless dismantle a 3,000-year military empire in less than 2 months. And they were terrified of what humanity might do next. Nwosu set the message down on her desk and stared out the window at the stars. The war was over, but the harder part, she realized, was just beginning. The peace talks began on a rainy morning on Draja Prime. Secretary General Nwosu chose to hold them on the planet's surface rather than aboard a ship. She wanted the Dragine to see that she was willing to walk on their world without an army at her back. She brought 12 people, translators, legal advisors, and 2 aides who carried nothing but data pads and water bottles. No soldiers, no weapons, no guards. The Dragine negotiators arrived with an escort of 40 warriors in ceremonial armor. They looked at Nwosu's small group and did not know whether to be insulted or impressed. The woman who had just broken their empire walked into the room as if she were visiting a friend's home for dinner. They sat across from each other at a long table in what had been a Dragine government building. Rain streamed down the tall windows. The room smelled like wet stone and something sharp that might have been Dragine incense. Nwosu opened her datapad and laid out humanity's terms. The room went very quiet. No territorial annexation. Humanity would not take a single Dragine world. Not one. No reparations. The Drajin would keep their economy, their trade routes, their resources. Full disarmament of all offensive military capability, with Galactic Concord inspectors monitoring compliance for 50 years. The Drajin could keep defensive forces to protect their own space, but they would never again build a fleet capable of invading anyone. A formal public apology for the unprovoked attack on human colonies. Joint funding for the reconstruction of Harvest Prime, Ashfall, New Lisbon, and Korat Station. And a cultural exchange program between Drajin and human worlds, starting with university students and expanding over time. The Drajin negotiators stared at the terms. One of them asked the translator to repeat them. Then he asked again. He looked at Nwosu as if she had grown a second head. "You are not taking our worlds?" he asked. "No," Nwosu said. "You are not demanding tribute?" "No." "You are not placing your soldiers on our planets to control our people?" "No." The negotiator sat back in his chair. He looked at his colleagues. None of them spoke. In 3,000 years of Drajin history, no victor had ever offered terms like these. When the Drajin won a war, they took everything. Territory, resources, freedom. That was what victory meant. That was what it had always meant. They asked for time to discuss. Nwosu agreed and stepped outside into the rain. She stood under the gray sky of an alien world and closed her eyes and breathed. 2 days later, the Drajin accepted the terms. Every single one. There was one more meeting before the formal signing. High Warlord Talvarath was brought from his holding cell to face Nwosu directly. He came in chains, escorted by 2 human marines, who walked beside him without touching him. His wounds had healed, but something in his eyes had not. He looked older than he had before the war, smaller. He stood before Nwosu and studied her for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been burning in him since his capture. Why? It was one word, but it carried the weight of everything he could not understand. Why did they not take his worlds? Why did they not enslave his people? Why did they treat prisoners with kindness and civilians with respect? Why did they fight with such terrible fury and then offer peace as if the fury had never existed? Nwosu looked at him with eyes that held no hatred and no pity, just understanding. "Because we have been where you are," she said. "Thousands of years ago, we burned each other's cities. We enslaved each other's children. We built weapons that could destroy our own world, and we nearly used them. We did terrible things to each other, Warlord, things that would make your conquests look gentle by comparison." Talvarath said nothing. He listened. "It took us centuries to climb out of that darkness," Nwosu continued. "Centuries and millions of lives. We know what it costs. We know the scars it leaves. And we made a choice, a very difficult choice, to never inflict that on anyone else." She paused. "But we also made another choice. We chose to never allow it to be inflicted on us. That is why your fleet is gone, Warlord. Not because we enjoy destruction, because you left us no other option." Talvarath was quiet for a long time. Then he lowered his head slightly, just a fraction, in what was the closest thing to a bow that a Drajin warlord had ever given to an enemy. "You are a strange species," he said. "Yes," Nwosu said, "we are." 3 weeks later, Nwosu stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord. 200 species, thousands of delegates. The largest diplomatic gathering in galactic history, because every civilization in the galaxy wanted to hear what humanity would say, now that it had revealed what it truly was. Nwosu knew about the 14 species mobilizing their fleets. She knew the galaxy was afraid. She addressed it directly, because she believed that fear left unspoken grows into something worse. She acknowledged that humanity's military capability had shocked the galactic community. She said plainly that she understood their concern. A species that could build a war fleet in 3 weeks and dismantle an empire in 2 months was by any reasonable measure frightening. Then she made 3 announcements. First, humanity would voluntarily seal the lunar vault again. The weapons inside would be locked away, just as they had been before the war, under the same restrictions and the same promise. They would only be opened again if humanity's survival was at stake. Second, the wartime fleet would be decommissioned. The converted freighters and civilian vessels would be disarmed and returned to their original purposes. The hidden shipyards would go dark. Humanity would return to its peacetime military posture. Third, she offered a new treaty to any species that wanted to sign it. A mutual defense agreement, open to all, in which every signatory promised to come to the aid of any other if they were attacked without provocation. Humanity would protect others the same way it protected itself. The assembly was silent for a long moment. Then Nuosu delivered the words that would be quoted for centuries after, the words that every species in the galaxy would eventually know by heart. "Let this conflict serve as a lesson," she said. "Not a threat, but a truth. We are not combative by nature, but we are relentless by necessity. We did not seek this war. We ended it. And we will end any war that is brought to our home. Every time, without exception, without limit." She paused and let the silence fill the enormous chamber. "But we would rather build than destroy. We would rather heal than wound. We would rather sit at this table with all of you and talk about trade routes and cultural exchanges and scientific partnerships than ever build another warship. That is our nature. That is our choice, and we make it freely, knowing full well what we are capable of." She stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted for 11 seconds. Then the Karathi delegation began to applaud, their forearms creating a sound like rain on a metal roof. The Vareshi joined them. Then the Ulani. Then, one by one, every delegation in the hall. Ambassador Fesick published its final report on the human conflict. It became the most widely read document in the history of the Galactic Concord. Translated into 400 languages, studied in military academies and diplomatic schools across the galaxy. Its final line was the one everyone remembered. They could rule this galaxy. They choose not to. That is what makes them the most dangerous species alive. The 14 species quietly stood down their fleets. One by one, they signed Nuosu's Mutual Defense Treaty. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed in small ways that added up to something large. Admiral Lyra Okonkwo retired. She moved to Harvest Prime, to the colony she had liberated, and bought a small piece of land on the edge of the capital. The city was still being rebuilt. Cranes and construction drones filled the skyline. Okonkwo planted a garden in her yard. She grew tomatoes and sunflowers, and a dragine herb that one of the cultural exchange students had given her. Kale Morrow was offered 3 separate promotions, a Medal of Valor, and a command position in the newly expanded Colonial Defense Fleet. He turned down all of them. He went back to Ashfall and went back to work as an engineer, fixing water pumps and reinforcing mine shafts. When people called him a hero, he shook his head and said that the real heroes were the ones who did not come home. Governor Zhao was re-elected by every single voter on Harvest Prime. His first official act was commissioning a memorial wall in the center of the rebuilt capital. Every name lost in the bombardment was carved into black stone, and at the top, a single line that Zhao had written himself. "They were here. They mattered. We remember." Talverat served his sentence in a human facility that was clean and quiet and nothing like the prisons he had built for his own conquered peoples. He was given books. He asked for more. Over the months and years, he read everything he could find about human history. He read about their world wars, their genocides, their atomic bombs, and their concentration camps, and their centuries of slavery. He read about the long, painful, imperfect climb out of that darkness. And slowly, Very slowly, he began to understand what kind of species he had attacked. Not a weak species that had been lucky. A terrifying species that had chosen, against every instinct and every advantage, to be kind. On Earth, on a bright afternoon 6 months after the war ended, a little girl sat in a schoolyard and looked up at the sky. She asked her teacher why the stars had gone dark for a while. She had heard grown-ups talking about it, but nobody would explain. Her teacher, a young woman who had spent the war volunteering in a field hospital and still had nightmares about it, knelt down beside her and smiled. "Because someone far away made a mistake," she said. "But it is over now. The stars are safe again." The little girl nodded and went back to playing. Above her, the sky was blue and clear, and the stars, though she could not see them in the daylight, were still there. They had always been there, waiting, patient, quiet. Just like humanity.